the worst case scenario. This is an unlikely scenario, but I want to put it in some context. When this conflict began, when Putin poured 250,000 troops over the border, he then turned to the rest of the world and he said, if you help Ukraine, I will F you up. Freeze, fry, famine. I will cut off the fuel to Europe and Europe will freeze. I will send fissionable material, nukes, and I will fry you. And I will cut off the food and from the breadbasket of Europe, and there will be famine in Africa. Right? I will F you up, the 3 Fs, freeze, fry, famine. Since then, there has been a lot of nuclear rhetoric out of Moscow. But Putin cannot use a nuke here in Ukraine. He can't even mine Zaporizhia anymore. Well, Zaporizhia is mined, but he can't set it off because yesterday, the Senate in the United States passed a resolution that radiological fallout from any radiological attack in Ukraine that lands in NATO territory will trigger Article 5 and NATO will join the fight against Russia. Putin's been lying to his people for a year and a half, saying that it's us against NATO, us against NATO, us against NATO, and NATO's not even on the ground yet. He pulls any radiological attack in Ukraine. It is now likely that under the leadership of the United States, because that's all that this resolution from the Senate does, right, is it sends a message. Doesn't officially trigger Article 5. It wouldn't officially trigger Article 5. We still have to go to our NATO allies. But we've made it clear to Putin that we're going to go to them and we're going to say that a radiological attack on Ukraine is that it results in fallout on a NATO nation is equivalent to attack on NATO. And with Poland right next door, there's no way you're not going to detect strontium-90 in the atmosphere. That's going to happen, right? Or any other number of radiological particles from such a blast. If you've been watching the news, the Russian news, you know that increasingly in the last few months, the Russian propagandists are talking about nuclear attacks against European cities, European capitals, America, Ukraine. They seem to be actively preparing the Russian people for a nuclear event. Putin believes that his nuclear arsenal makes him invincible. Could he be so far gone? And remember, Russian nuclear doctrine states that nukes can be used in any existential crisis if the existence of Russia is threatened. And by the existence of Russia, what they're really talking about is the current power structure in the Kremlin. If there's an existential threat to Russia, Russia may use its tactical nuclear weapons. Now, we've said before that there's very little value in using a tactical nuke in Ukraine. It doesn't make sense. But if Prigozhin and all his forces march to Moscow and are in one place on the battlefield, and they're all within a 12-kilometer diameter of each other, then a 4 to 7 kiloton nuclear device, right, the average size of a Russian tactical nuke, would put an end to this threat. Putin may be thinking that it would also show the world that he wasn't bluffing, right? How many times has he said, I'm not bluffing, I got nukes? This could be his chance to use one. And by the grace of God, it would be against his own people, not us. Now, the political analysts in Washington and the military people that I know, I was actually just talking to a buddy of mine in Berlin who's an infantryman and knows a thing or two about warfare. And he says that I'm crazy, that this is ridiculous, that Putin is not going to nuke his own people. And he's probably right? I'm wrong all the time. Just ask my ex-wife. But let's not forget that Putin is the same person who bombed civilian apartment complexes in Moscow, murdering hundreds of Russian citizens in order to start a war with Chechnya. He blamed that on Chechen terrorists, but it was him. So I don't know what's going to happen. Nobody knows what's going to happen. We are watching history unfold in front of us. We are at an inflection point in history. The outcome of these days is likely to affect multiple generations of humanity. Thank you so much for joining me. I grew up in the Cold War. My greatest fear was always Russian nukes. And that's probably coloring my assessment here. But it does concern me deeply that we might just see the first Hiroshima-like event since Hiroshima. Let's hope I'm wrong. Please, by the grace of God, let me be wrong.